Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar about brand raising with Sarah Durham. Again, I'm Lindsay Nichols. I'm the Communications Director here at GuideStar. So I have a lot in common with all of you. We all are trying to communicate effectively, and we want to use all of the tools at our disposal. So I'm really excited to hear from Sarah. I know all of you are. This webinar sold out really quickly, so we're thrilled you could make time for this and be with us. Before I introduce her, I need to take care of just a few housekeeping items. First, we're live tweeting during today's presentation using the hashtag Brandraising, all one word, so please join our conversation on Twitter. Again, that hashtag is Brandraising. Secondly, we're happy to take questions from you during the presentation, either through Twitter or through the chat function. Again, to submit a question, you just use the question feature on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And if we can't get to all of your questions before our time is up, we're going to post some additional ones on the GuideStar blog and on the Big Duck blog as well. And finally, we will send all of you an email with today's presentation and a recording of this live discussion in a few days. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce Sarah Durham, principal and founder of Big Duck, the leading communications firm that works exclusively with nonprofits. She was named a top fundraiser under 40 by Fundraising Success magazine in 2006 and one of the most influential women in technology by Fast Company magazine in 2010. She's the author of Brandraising, How Nonprofits Raise Visibility and Money Through Smart Communications, and it's a great read, so I encourage you to check it out. We're really lucky to have Sarah with us, so I'm happy to get this started. Sarah, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'm delighted to be here. And I'm looking forward to diving in. As Lindsay noted, we are going to cover a lot of content today, and we're going to leave some time at the end for questions, but feel free to chat them in or follow along on Twitter. And just to put this a little bit in context, in case you don't know Big Duck, we're a Brooklyn-based communications firm that works exclusively with nonprofits. And the picture you see on your screen right now is the view out my window as I give this webinar. We've been working with nonprofits for about 19 years, and a lot of the stuff I'm going to cover today are really like lessons learned from being in the trenches with real nonprofits who are struggling to do more with less every day in their communications. And I'm going to take you through a lot of different stuff today, and so I'm not going to be following the Twitter stream closely during the webinar itself, but I will catch up with it later. And if you want to follow me, I'm Big Duck Sarah, and I'll be monitoring the Brandraising hashtag afterwards. So what we're going to cover today is a mix of theory and practice. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're in a more competitive communications environment than ever, what branding means for all of that, and take you through a case study that I hope will give you a sense of some of the elements and how they come together as you either build or refine your organization's brand. And I think one of the things that is particularly important to kind of remember as we get started is that nonprofit people who work in organizations like Lindsay at GuideStar and other great organizations frequently come to that work for kind of passionate reasons. They're inspired by the mission. They want to make the world a better place. And they probably didn't grow up saying, you know, I want to be a fundraiser when I grow up, or I want to be responsible for communications. And so oftentimes we are lacking in-house at nonprofits some of the basic kind of marketing skills and backgrounds that some of our for-profit industry counterparts have. So we're going to learn a little bit from them first, and then we're going to see how it's different for nonprofits. And one of the things I love to do when I'm in a room with a group of people is to put the slide up on screen and ask people in the room if they recognize these brands. And what I find is that everybody recognizes all of these brands, and they do because these are blue chip for-profit businesses that probably spend more money on marketing and communications in a month than most people on this webinar will ever have to work with at their nonprofit. They are businesses that can really afford to raise visibility for themselves in a big way, but also they're businesses that have transactional relationships with a lot of us. So we know what Target is or what Starbucks is or what McDonald's is because we might be their customers. We might actually walk in the door and use their products. And that is a very different set of variables than those affecting most nonprofits. If I show you logos like these of some major national or international organizations in the nonprofit space, you might recognize most of their names, but it gets a lot harder to, in a kind of a quick soundbite, say what business they're in. A lot of people might have heard of a nonprofit, but they don't really know what it does, and they might not really know why they should support it. So over many years of kind of studying this, we've been thinking about, like, why is that? I mean, other than the fact that most nonprofits can't afford to market as aggressively, what are some of the other variables that make it different or more challenging for a nonprofit to communicate? And essentially what we've concluded is that fundamentally nonprofit communications are harder because they require reaching a more diverse set of audiences and achieving a number of goals, not just that simple transactional goal of selling a product or service. So when you think about how your nonprofit communicates, you probably have three main reasons you try to communicate. You need to raise money. You need to make your programs work, so you need to raise awareness or increase your visibility, maybe to attract clients or build your membership. And you might also be interested in raising awareness so that you can do some advocacy work. You might, for instance, do legislative work, or you might just want to be the go-to resource in your community for your issue, which is also a type of advocacy. So these three different goals have some points of overlap and maybe some audiences like your board where there's overlap, but a lot of times the people we're trying to communicate with to raise money are quite different from the programmatic or the advocacy audiences, and that can make it a lot harder. We have to reach very different people with very different agendas. So again, going back to that fundamental question, why do nonprofits struggle to communicate clearly? There is a kind of an obvious budget reality, and I think particularly in the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of organizations struggle as their budgets for communications or their staff for communications have gotten cut. But I think it's also important to remember that 10 or 15 years ago, we also lived in a much simpler communications world. We used the phone, we used direct mail, and we had face-to-face meetings. And the vast majority of how we communicated, if we were working in the nonprofit space, sort of focused on these three channels and tools, whereas these days we live in this very, very noisy environment where not only do we as communicators have a lot more choices for the channels and tools we can use to reach people, but people on the receiving end, including ourselves, are feeling very overwhelmed. There's so much to do every day just to get through our email inboxes that it's even harder to really pay attention to organizations we want to pay attention to. So what are the lessons for this? How do we leverage that? I want to start by giving you a couple of things to think about that I hope will help you sort of pierce through that clutter and ideally get your team, your staff, and your board singing from the same songbook so that as you're communicating, no matter what audience you're communicating with, you're doing so with sort of clarity and purpose and internal alignment. One of the exercises we do at Big Duck with all of our clients, and granted our clients tend to be mid-size or larger nonprofits, but one of the things we do with them that I would encourage you to do no matter how big or small you are is we ask them to give us a year or two worth of the stuff they've been sending out. Event invitations, flyers, brochures, annual reports. We might print out pages from their website or from Facebook, and we lay it all out on the table and we take a look. And a lot of times when we go through that exercise, what we notice are a lot of mixed messages, a lot of different colors, typefaces, logos, different elements being used, in part because people are, getting creative, and in part because there isn't necessarily somebody inside the organization who's trying to kind of weave it together as a whole. So in this slide, what you see is one organization's communications, but each of these things was produced by a different person on staff who was kind of given free license to create whatever they needed to create without necessarily weaving it back to the mother brand. If we look at the for-profit world and we take, again, one of those blue chip brands, in this case Coca-Cola, what you notice with an organization or a business like Coke is that basically since the dawn of time, they've been using the same elements, the same colors, the same essential logo design, and even these days as they communicate in newer, more kind of digitally relevant ways, they're still referencing that core brand. They're still going right back to those elements that are at the heart of who they are as a business, and connecting those dots for us, so that whether we see a QR code on the streets of an international city, or we see something, locally in our backyard, it all weaves back together to the mother brand. But for some reason in the nonprofit world, we tend to forget to do that. We tend to get creative with the stuff we produce. And in getting creative, we have a lot of fun, but we lose the ability to connect the dots for the person on the other end, so that they know, who we are, and they associate the annual report they just got in the mail with the website they might have visited last month, or the e-news that they get next month. So one of the big things that I want to begin by sort of emphasizing here is the power of consistency. Consistency really counts, and I would encourage you to try that exercise back at your organization. Just lay out all your materials on a table and review them, perhaps with your leadership team, with no agenda. Just see what pops out at you. What's working, what's not working, what do you think needs to change in order to sing from the same songbook with a bit more cohesion and consistency. So with that sort of background, I want to also kind of break down the brand raising model and what I'm talking about when I use that term. And what I'm going to cover in the next few slides is essentially a cheat sheet to what is in my book. And I hope that this will give you a way to sort of connect your day-to-day communications with your organizational strategy. So what you see on this slide are 3 layers in a pyramid, which we call the brand raising model. And this begins with the organizational level, that top third. And your organizational level, we call it that because these are the elements that inform everything you do, not just your communications. And it really is the stuff of strategic planning. It's your vision, your mission, your values, your organizational objectives, and clarity about the audiences you need to reach. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, what's a good time for an organization to re-examine or refine or shore up its brand? And my answer to that, pretty much without exception, is right after a good strategic planning process. The point when you have internal alignment about who you are, where you're heading, and what you want to achieve at a strategic level is really the best time to then say, are we doing a good job expressing all of that externally? I'm going to come back in a minute to positioning and personality, which are also at the organizational layer. But those are marketing terms that need a little bit more unpacking. So let's just jump down to the next level, which is the identity level. This is the level most people think of when they think of branding. Your visual identity, obviously more than just your logo, it's also the colors you use, the typography you use, the way you use photography. Your messaging platform starts with your name. Your name is perhaps the farthest traveled brand ambassador you have as an organization. How you abbreviate that name, the way you use your name and a tagline together, the key messages you use to articulate who you are. So we'll come back to this in a little bit, but I want to sort of flag here that I think it's important to note that branding doesn't begin here. And if you're thinking of going through a change in your brand, I would really encourage you to not start by just designing new logos or developing key messages or sitting down to write an elevator pitch as the first step. You'll see as we unpack things a little bit more that this is a layer that's deliberately sandwiched in between your organizational strategy and the last layer, which is the day-to-day communications where people interact with you. And I think it's really important to keep it there. It's, your logo, your key messages, all those things are very, very important in the context of expressing your organization's strategy and helping make it easier for people on the outside to sort of come inside and connect with you. And they do that online, in print, on air, in person, and increasingly through cell phones. I would actually just flag that this is another huge shift. Obviously, these days we're doing the vast majority of our communications online, maybe as much as 90%, which is a radical change from where we were maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So the goal of all of this is about being clear about what you want to say as an organization and how you want to say it. And it sort of sounds really obvious to say that, but how many times have you had that experience where you're in the middle of, let's say, writing an article for an e-newsletter or writing a speech for your executive director to give, where you've kind of had that moment of saying, wait a minute, what am I really trying to say here? What is it that we really have to get across about our organization? It's a little bit like getting on a cruise ship in a harbor. If you know the destination your cruise ship is sailing for, you don't have to see it, but having that latitude and longitude gives you purpose. You don't just, come out of the harbor and sail around arbitrarily hoping you get to that, beautiful destination. But a lot of times in our day-to-day communications, we're so busy working reactively that we end up doing that. We just kind of sail around hoping we're hitting the right people with the right messages. And I would argue that the key to having a clear destination and being clear about what you want to say is positioning and personality. So we're going to go back up and unpack those a little bit. And I want you to really think about the potential for your organization to have a vision for what it wants to say that is essentially wrapped up in two different concepts. So first is positioning. And positioning is the big differentiating idea you strive to own in the minds of your target audiences. So what is it you want them to think of you, the way when I showed you that slide with FedEx or Target or McDonald's or Nike, you see those logos or you hear that name and it means something. You have some idea who those guys are. If you get your positioning right, it not only is useful in terms of sticking in the minds of your target audiences, but it also can really help differentiate your organization from your peers so that donors or clients understand why they should connect with you rather than perhaps connect with another organization in your space. One really, I think, useful example of great positioning is the Red Cross. If I were in a room with you and there are, right now several hundred people in our virtual room, if I could ask all of you, what do you think of when you think of the Red Cross? The vast majority of you would probably say disaster relief. The Red Cross has done an exceptional job establishing that that's kind of the space that they own in our minds. That's their positioning. They've also done a really nice job asserting that they are a go-to resource for blood donation work. And actually, if you look at how they communicate, if you look at their website, you read their materials, even if you watch how they communicate through social media, you'll see that they really reinforce those ideas over and over and over again at each point. So I'd love you to pause for a minute and maybe just think about, what do you want people to think of when they think of your organization? And I'd encourage you to think of it in its simplest, purest form, because if what you want people to think of when they think of your organization requires you to spend 5 minutes explaining it, chances are it's not going to stick in the outside audience's mind in some way that's actually going to do you any good. I mean, if you give me your elevator pitch and I can't kind of loosely paraphrase it an hour later or a day later or a week later, chances are it's too complicated. So what I want to encourage you to do is to craft your organization's positioning and use it as a tool to inform and evaluate your communications. So what that means is, with that positioning, go back and look at your logo, look at your name, look at your tagline, look at your website, and ask yourself the question, is this doing a good job communicating this simple idea that we want to make sure people associate with us? When we do this work at Big Duck, we get at positioning by asking questions like these. And we ask questions like these of board members, of staff members, of donors, of volunteers. We might survey a wide range of people connected to an organization to try to really kind of pin down, what is that special sauce? What is the thing that this organization can really own that hopefully nobody else can own, so they can assert it in everything they do? The second part of your communication strategy is being really clear on the personality you want to communicate, and that's the overarching feeling you want people to associate with your organization. Sometimes I think of it as kind of the taste in your mouth that you're left with after you see something about an organization. And one of my favorite ways to think about this is to think about this idea of anthropomorphizing your organization, or if your organization were a person, what kind of person would it be? Just like in these Mac commercials, if you ever saw them, the Mac was portrayed as this kind of hip, smart guy, whereas the IBM was portrayed as this bumbling buffoon. I'm not suggesting you should set up your peers or your competitors to look bad, but what I am suggesting is that you should spend some time thinking about the personality of your organization and maybe how it might differentiate you from others in your space if you use it deliberately. One way to kind of get deeper into this concept is to take 3 different organizations who all have something in common from a mission point of view. ASPCA, Humane Society, and PETA are all in different ways in the business of fighting cruelty to animals. But the way they do that work, both programmatically and in their communications, is done with very different personalities. And if you respond positively to the more edgy or intense styles and methodologies that PETA uses, you'd be more likely to support PETA in a fundraising appeal than you might one of the other organizations. Or if you love the sort of warm and friendly puppies and kittens stuff that ASPCA has done, you might be more likely to support them. All 3 are totally valid as different ways to communicate, and they really go a long way to communicate sort of the distinction from each other when they're true to these personality attributes. So what I'm suggesting here is that you sort of, in a disciplined way, define your nonprofit's personality so that you can be deliberate about the tone and the style you use to communicate. If you remember that slide I showed you where there were a million different things happening from one organization, that wouldn't happen if that organization had been very specific about the 3 or 4 adjectives it really wanted to kind of, assert in everything it does. So to get to your organization's personality, you ask questions that maybe you've heard before and wondered what they were about. Questions like, if we had a mascot, what would it be? And what's funny about these questions is that they force us to free associate and to come up with things that unlock a more creative and intuitive association or side of our brain. And it's not actually the direct answer to this question that matters, it's the association behind it. So for instance, one year I was working with an organization where I interviewed about 20 different people, and I asked them all this question, what kind of vehicle would this organization be? And almost without exception, the people in this particular organization all said we'd be a silver BMW. And I was so struck by that because oftentimes the types of vehicles I hear are things like Priuses or school buses or things like that. But when I probed, okay, so why the silver BMW? What is it about that particular vehicle? People said, well, it's a performance vehicle. It's top-notch. It's the best of class. It's, quiet and efficient and excellent. And those are important clues to the personality of how this organization wants people to perceive it and what their communications might look like. That would make, give us a very good jumping off point for what types of photographs they might use or what type of color palette might be appropriate if they were going to rebuild their website. So the takeaway from this concept of developing a strategy that hinges on defining positioning and personality is that they can really drive your communications and connect it all back to your mission. In a way, personality and positioning are like a bridge that connects your, the language of your mission to the language or the materials of your day-to-day stuff. And I would encourage you, if you do define your positioning and personality, to do it as a team. Make it a collaborative exercise. Don't let one person sort of say, this is what it is, because it really has to be something that people organizationally understand, contribute to, and buy into. Otherwise, it often doesn't really take root. I know I'm moving pretty quickly here, and I'm doing so I can cover a lot of bases with you today, but I do want to flag there's a lot more information about positioning and personality and how to get to them in both my book and also on the Big Duck blog, which I'll give you a link to later on. So with positioning and personality, we then get back to that second layer, that identity level. And what I would encourage you to do, again, is assess your visual identity and your messaging platform using positioning and personality. And don't make change for change's sake. If you've got a logo, or you've got a name, or you've got a tagline that can actually, work with the positioning and personality you want, then you're in good shape. You don't need to make a change. If they don't work, I would encourage you to use those things to guide any changes that you do and really tread carefully. Your visual identity, as I noted, contains a number of different elements, and your messaging platform also contains a number of different elements. But I would encourage you in particular to think of your name, your tagline, and your logo as a system that have to work together. You'll see as you look around at a lot of major nonprofits that sometimes one of the elements in that system does a lot of the heavy lifting for others. So for instance, an organization like the March of Dimes, that is a name that now has a lot of equity. And they probably, if they were beginning today, would not name themselves the March of Dimes. But because they have all that equity in the name, they haven't changed it. They've used other elements in their system, like their logo or their tagline, to clarify elements of who they are, to express their personality, to express their positioning. So think of your name, your logo, and your tagline as a system. At Big Duck, we like to call it the core identity. And think about how those things in particular work together to communicate the essence of what you want to be known for. One of the other things that I would encourage you to really do after you've made any changes or after you've sort of confirmed you've got the right stuff is put it all into an organizational brand guide. And a lot of nonprofits these days do have style guides, which is a big step forward over where we were a while ago. But oftentimes what you see in organizations that have style guides is really visual stuff, that the style guide is more about, how to use the logo or how to use colors than it is about messaging. A brand guide is a little bit bigger and more inclusive. It details how to abbreviate the name or what your key messages are, and it really breaks down into a kind of clear, simple way how to communicate on behalf of the organization, whether you're writing or speaking or designing something. Truth of the matter is that most people in your organization are not going to be responsible for designing materials, but they are going to be responsible for writing and making sure that you've got your key messages and other elements written down will help ensure that when they're sitting down to write, they're not starting with a blank piece of paper every time. They're actually starting with these basic elements. So the takeaway of this piece is that your brand is not just your logo, it's your visuals and your messaging institutionalized through a brand guide and through trainings. And I haven't really talked much about trainings, but I do want to flag that trainings are great. Even just as new people come into your organization, walking them through that guide, talking to them about how to communicate on behalf of your organization can really go a long way towards getting everybody to sing from the same songbook. And I would actually say that this is one of the greatest takeaways of a branding exercise when people ask me what the value is of branding. Oftentimes, the immediate value is the ability to very quickly get everybody communicating much more efficiently and effectively on behalf of the organization. And then there's the long-term value of the impact that has as people on the outside become clearer who you are, clearer why they should support you, and excited to be a part of your extended family. Once we get down to the experiential level, we're really into day-to-day communications, and I would suggest to you that when you change your brand, especially if you're an organization that's been around for a while, you're really in some ways going through a process that's not unlike renovating a home. If you're a new organization, it's almost like building a home from scratch. You can throw parties in your home the way it is now, but if you renovate it and you make sure everything is working and there's, good airflow through rooms and things are well lit, it just makes it a lot more fun to throw that party. You know that you're welcoming people into a home that you really feel good about. And I think that's an important kind of way to start to think about things, because once we get into day-to-day communications, we have to really stop thinking about what makes us feel good as we talk about our organization and think more about what the people we're trying to reach are going to feel good about. What's the benefit to those people who we are trying to connect with what's the benefit to them for making a gift financially, or for volunteering, or for signing a petition. And I think we really have to begin, as we get into day-to-day communications, to put ourselves in the shoes of these people who we're trying to reach and speak in language that helps them understand the benefit they get from being a part of our extended family. We also really have to remember that now more than ever, that donor you're trying to reach or that legislator you're trying to reach is a very busy person who's got a lot of competing things going on in their lives. And so our organization and the things we want to ask of them are really just a blip. And we're going to have to work pretty hard to penetrate all the noise in their life and compel them to, connect with us. That's why I would encourage you to think about the language that you're using as and ask yourself the question, are you communicating in a way that is audience-centric? The way Just Do It is a great audience-centric tagline. If you've ever tried to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning on a rainy day and go running, you would never think of a tagline like, buy our sneakers. But a tagline like Just Do It is really speaking to you and trying to help you get out of bed. Another great example of audience-centric communications is this ad campaign that's been running on the New York City subways for about 30 years, where the headline says, "This poster can make you happier than any other on the subway." This is an ad campaign for a nonprofit called the School of Practical Philosophy, and it's an ad that was actually developed by some volunteers many years ago, but it does such a good job making people come up to it, look at it, and driving people to their website where you learn all about what they do. It's very audience-centric and therefore very effective. The organization-centric version of this, if you could imagine sort of the other end of the spectrum, might say something like, at the School of Practical Philosophy, we have 150 programs a week that do X, Y, Z, P, D, and Q. It sounds so dry when you compare it to this, but that's actually how a lot of us do communicate. We have language on our websites that say things like our programs, about us, about our services, not how we help you, or do you need X, or could we support you with Y, right? So put yourself in their shoes. And this is also a good kind of litmus test for that exercise you might do. If you lay all of your stuff out on the table, ask yourself the question, how are we doing? Are we great at audience-centric communications, or could you do better there? And oftentimes just taking that language and spinning it can really help. And in order to get there, you might find you also need to do a little bit of research into your target audiences so that you can be sure you're communicating on their terms, not on yours. I'm not going to go into this in depth right now just because of the amount of time that we've got, but I do want to flag that a lot of organizations benefit a lot from developing user personas and using those user personas to test materials against them. So if you've been through a website overhaul process in the past 5 or 6 years, you probably know what I mean. In a user persona web exercise, what you're doing is you're thinking about the types of people who are likely to visit your website, and you're trying to sort of think, okay, if I were in this person's shoes, what would I be looking for on the website? What kinds of actions would I be interested in taking? And maybe from the organization's point of view, what do we hope this person is gonna do, or how are they gonna connect? I would really encourage you to think about that idea for all of your communications. Stop thinking about why you want the person to give and start thinking about why they might want to give to you. What's in it for them? I actually, on the wall of my office, which I can look at right now as I'm speaking to you, I have a picture, a collage of about 10 different faces on it. And each of those faces represents a different person that I work with as sort of an archetype of different people. And when I'm writing something or blogging or talking to you on this webinar, I'm not thinking about what I want to get from this. I'm thinking about what those people want to get from this. And if I can speak to them and give them something meaningful, chances are I'm doing my job pretty well. Okay, so I want to take you through a case study, and then I'm going to share some resources with you, and then we'll open it up for questions. So the case study I'm going to take you through is for an organization called the New York Peace Institute. And I chose this case study because it's actually a pretty small organization that was under the umbrella of a larger organization. The larger organization they were under was a direct service organization here in New York City called Safe Horizon. And they spun off into their own nonprofit. And so they had the opportunity to really think this stuff through sort of from the ground up. So there are a lot of basic pieces in place that I think are useful to look at. So before the New York Peace Institute spun off as its own nonprofit, they were a program at Safe Horizon about mediation and conflict resolution. And if you were to learn about them, you would have done so by looking at the Safe Horizon website. You might have seen a page like this that would tell you all about what mediation is and how they help mediate in a number of different contexts. When they decided to spin off into their own organization, the board of directors determined that the name of this new organization was going to be the New York Peace Institute. So they came up with that name, and they felt pretty good about it, although there was a lot of debate about that name and if that name was going to actually communicate everything they needed. As they got into kind of building their brand-raising framework, they asked the question and found the answer. What do we want people to think of when they think of us? What's our positioning? And the positioning that they want to establish is that they are the go-to people for mediation and conflict response. And that was a useful clue to how they were going to build the rest of their pieces, alongside with their personality, which is urban, friendly, fearless, passionate, et cetera, et cetera. I want to flag for you also as you go through a personality exercise that most organizations are very tempted to use words in their personality like responsible, credible, respectable. And actually, when we work with an organization, we almost always throw those words out in the first round. And we throw them out because they're not distinguishing. Your organization, it should be a given that you're credible and respectable. If you're not credible and respectable, you have a bigger problem than communications. What I really want to push you to do is to think about the attributes that are very distinguishing for you, that are attributes that you're comfortable claiming that maybe others in your space would not be comfortable claiming. I would argue that in the case of the New York Peace Institute, urban is perhaps the most unique and compelling word on this list because it's the word that is the most distinguishing potentially from others in their space. With that positioning and personality, we went back and we took a look at their vision and their mission and all their messaging and actually rewrote some elements. So I would argue that it is the board's purview to set the strategy behind your organization, but it's the staff's purview to work on the language that is used to express that concept so that outside audiences can connect with it. Ooh, that's a tongue twister. One of the things I really felt excited about for the New York Peace Institute was where their mission statement ended up. I love that their mission statement begins with the sentence, "People disagree and arguments escalate," as experts in conflict response, and then they go on to tell you what they do. I love that they actually, in their mission, do something that helps you kind of get your bearings as an outsider and understand why they need to exist. That actually is kind of the basis of how they think about their messaging platform too. Their messaging platform begins by articulating a problem. And so if you speak to Brad Heckman, their executive director, or a member of their board, and you ask them, tell me about the New York Peace Institute. What is it you guys do? They're going to start by telling you that we live in a communications culture that's very conflict-laden, and that we often resolve those disputes really badly. And then they're going to go on to tell you what the New York Peace Institute does as a solution to that problem. And then, if they've really got it together, they're actually going to give you a call to action. They're going to ask you to take some sort of action to support them, maybe a donation, maybe joining them in some kind of way. So problem, solution, action is the framework for their key messages. That's not necessarily right for every organization, but that simple framework really helps everybody in their organization be clear what they want to communicate at every point of contact they have. And it also helped them set up a very simple elevator pitch, 2 sentences that they've got memorized that basically cover the bases of their key messages in kind of short, sweet language. on the visual side, as they were thinking about how to articulate their identity, the team that worked on this looked at their core identity, again, as a system of the logo, the name, and the tagline. And what you see here are a few of the explorations that some people on the Big Duck team worked on with them to help them, think through the way that all these things come together, and in particular, how a visual or how a tagline can help clarify some things about what they do with a name that doesn't always, give it all away. In the end, they selected this visual identity. I think you can really see how the urban aspect of their personality shines through in this mark. And here's what it looks like as it gets applied to stuff. The tagline that they selected was "Let us get in the middle." So a tagline like "Let us get in the middle" with a name like New York Peace Institute and a logo that is two thought bubbles coming together, all together that tells the story of their positioning and uses the style of their personality. And then, they start to blow out this look and feel across print materials, across website, stuff, web pages, microsites, etc. So that was a pretty quick case study, but I wanted you to see a little bit how the visuals and the messaging come together. And in their case, also one of the things I really like on this page is how the language that they use to explain what they do is written, again, in a way that's very, very in line with that personality. It's friendly, it's urban, and that really gets across sort of a feeling about who they are that does the job. Okay, so I'm going to ask people to be chatting in questions if you haven't done so already, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of resources if you want to learn more about this, or if you are, as many organizations we work with are, knee-deep really in thinking about your year-end campaign, your year-end appeal. This is the Big Duck website. It's bigducknyc.com, and if you go to the website, I've highlighted on this slide our workshops and our blog areas, which you can find. We give a lot of free workshops. Some of them are workshops that happen in our Brooklyn office. Some of them are with partners. And then we also give a lot of webinars like this one we're doing today with GuideStar. And a couple of things you can find on our website under workshops are our webinar archive, where you can actually watch other webinars we've recorded for free. You can watch them anytime you want. You just click on workshops and then click on webinar archive to find those things. We've got a couple things coming up in our Brooklyn office on October 16th. We're doing an hour or two long training called Is It Time to Rethink Your Website? And on October 30th, we're giving a webinar called Campaigns as an Experience of Your Brand, which is really about how your brand starts to play out as you try to fundraise or raise awareness or recruit in very specific ways with very specific audiences. And then lastly, I just want to flag that the book Brandraising has a lot more detail about everything I've touched on today, and you can find it online at amazon.com. So with that, I want to just see if I think Lindsay is going to sort of feed me some questions.
You got it. We have a bunch coming in, so keep those questions coming, and I'm just going to pick around and try to get some that are really interesting. So one is, and I think this is really relevant to the nonprofit sector because so many of us have started with one or two people's passion, getting a mission going. How do you help a nonprofit transition from a founder's, face, name, language to a larger organizational brand?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's definitely something we've dealt with many times. Oftentimes when a founder is starting to, move away, they've either moved on or retired or something like that, the organization's identity is very mixed up in their identity. They've often been the main fundraiser. People have supported the organization, and largely because they see the organization as this person's life work. And actually, I would say that that's a really, before that person leaves, if possible, it's really ideal to start institutional discussions about the communications. And really, if you can get that founder on board with the idea that the organization should not just be a reflection of them, and you can start to develop an organizational positioning and personality and start to really weave that into everything you do before they go, what you can do if you're really lucky is you can transfer the equity that that person has back into the organization as an entity. Sometimes I find that the reality is that founders are really good at talking to people in ways that work for the founder, but that other people can't talk to people that way. And so sometimes what other organizations I've seen do successfully is let the new leadership really do a pretty significant overhaul, but just really try to bring past donors, past volunteers, people who were part of the founder-built organization along on the journey, so that it doesn't feel to them like like they've lost the thread. It's definitely a sticky wicket, and there's been a lot that's been written about life cycles and founder-led organizations, and I would encourage you to take a look at some of that stuff. And I wouldn't rush to change communication stuff in the midst of a major leadership transition. I think oftentimes the best time to change communications is after the dust has settled a little bit with a new leadership.
Absolutely. That's great. So how important is it to always use the same coloring in your materials?
I think the color consistency is a much bigger issue than most organizations give merit to. And the reason I think that is, before we could all produce stuff online really easily, we had to usually pick one or two organizational colors and use them consistently. We would print with Pantone colors or something like that. But in this day of four-color printing, we tend to throw as much color as we can at everything. And I think that often does us more of a disservice. Color is one of the biggest ways people register something, and they register it almost on a subconscious level. So if I had to choose between you being consistent with your colors or being consistent with your typography or your use of imagery, I'd encourage you to start by being consistent with your colors. But you can also set up a color palette that's a restricted color palette. You can say, these are our two primary colors, here are 3 or 4 secondary colors. So when we're talking about this program, we use our primary colors in this way, and we use this particular secondary color to highlight that program. So I guess that's a long answer to say that I'd really love to see you be as consistent as you can be with color, but that doesn't mean it can't be fun.
Excellent. So is it better to roll out a consistent brand all at once or gradually?
These days, it's pretty hard to flip the switch. So we see a lot of organizations rolling out brands over time, but I would say that your brand really hasn't changed until your website has changed. And so I would encourage you to think of your website going live as really the official launch. And a lot of organizations we work with tend to sit on the changes that they're making and keep them somewhat hush-hush and use that web launch as really the official changeover. I think to not waste materials, I think it's fine if you keep using the same stationery or the same brochure for a couple of weeks or a month or two afterwards. But if you let it dribble on over too much time, it does start to confuse people. So I'd rather see you really plan it deliberately and maybe wait to launch a little bit longer than you might like, just so that period of time that's transitional is as short as it can be.
Great. This question just came in via Twitter, and I think it's interesting. Do you feel that press releases have a significant role in increasing brand awareness?
Ooh, I love that question. I've become increasingly skeptical of the value of media relations. And so to answer your question directly, I think there are very few organizations that get any great benefit from press releases. The organizations that do tend to be organizations that are using press releases as an advocacy tool. So if, for instance, you're trying to change people's minds about an issue before they go to vote, or change people's behaviors by getting them to do things that require constant reminder and awareness, like wearing a seatbelt or wearing a helmet or using a condom, getting that discussion out there in mainstream media is a useful thing. But for most organizations, getting a little bit of press doesn't really make as big a difference these days as it used to, because there are so many channels and tools that people are reading. So just to say this a little differently, 10 years ago, if your nonprofit got written about in the New York Times, it would have had a huge impact. You would have gotten checks in the mail, you would have gotten phone calls, your board would have called you, thrilled. These days, if your nonprofit gets mentioned in the New York Times, you're lucky if you even see a blip in your web traffic. There is just so much saturation of media, and people are so busy that the impact is much less significant. So I would encourage you to shift away from a media-driven communication strategy, actually, traditional media-driven strategy, towards a more social media community management strategy as you think about where to spend your resources.
Excellent. Here is a great question. How does a nonprofit handle being an affiliate or, an umbrella organization where there are many affiliates with its own logo? How do you deal with the branding of that?
Yeah, that is a challenge that sometimes people call like a master brand challenge. So for a lot of organizations, if it's a national organization with local chapters, the national group sets the standards. They decide, how the locals can communicate. For some, the locals get to do whatever they want. I think it really, if you're a local and you're in a situation where you can do whatever you want, I would really encourage you to think about the value that you get from that association with other locals or with national. And I think if you get value from it, if people recognize your name or are more likely to trust you or support you because they associate you with this other group, then that's to your advantage. And I would encourage you to be consistent and to use stuff locally that aligns with what other people are using. But if you're under an umbrella where that doesn't really do you any good, then, it seems like you might be able to do your own thing with a little bit more confidence.
That's great. We've had a bunch of questions about kind of the board of directors involvement, so let's just kind of make it a larger question. What should the board of directors involvement be in a branding process?
Oh, I love those questions too. And actually, I blog about this exact issue a lot. So if you go to bigducknyc.com, click on the blog, and then do a search for a word like board, you'll find a lot about this. We actually even invited one of our clients to blog about how she, as a director of communications, managed her board during a rebrand. But it's a little different from organization to organization. We, every year we will take roughly a dozen nonprofits through the Brandraising process, and each one of them is going to involve the board a little differently. I think that you cannot leave your board out of a rebrand. If you do, and you come to that board meeting with a new this or a new that, and they haven't been a part of the conversation, the odds are very good they're going to reject it. The challenge is, how do you keep them involved in a way that is a good use of their time, a good use of your collective resources, and isn't derailing? When we work with nonprofits, we spend a lot of time talking to our staff clients about how to manage the board. And essentially the way we do it is we usually have a working committee or a working group that has some board representation on it. And we ask those board members on our working group to really embrace their roles as ambassadors of this work to the board. And I think along the way, depending on the culture of your organization, if you have an organization where the board is very much a governance board, they might be a little bit more hands-off than an organization that's very, grassroots and very kind of management associated. So you really have to adapt it to the board and be mindful upfront of how that's going to work. Don't just kind of go for it and hope that it sorts itself out, because it can be extremely derailing.
Excellent. So it looks like we have about 5 more minutes, probably a couple more questions we can take. When branding a complex organization, do you recommend having multiple marketing personalities for varied and unique programs?
In theory, I like the idea of that, but in practice, I've seen very few organizations that have the capacity to pull that off. So what I generally encourage organizations to do is start with a less is more approach. So start with positioning, personality, messaging, visual identity, all that kind of stuff that feels one size fits all, that you feel you can use for all the audiences you need to reach as a basic platform, and get that up and running and use it, get your people trained on it, use it for a little while. Once you feel like your team really has it under control and is doing a good job with it and is able to speak on message and is able to produce stuff, that works, then get into segmenting. Then I think it's possible to say, okay, let's go to the next level and let's develop a set of messages for this audience that's different, or to promote this program that's different. I do generally discourage nonprofits from creating sub-brands. And I say generally because there are some exceptions to that rule, but I wouldn't encourage you to have different logos, different names, different color treatments for different programs, because if somebody comes in through Program A, you want them to know that Program A is a part of your organization, and you want them potentially to connect with Programs B, C, and D. And if Program A looks and feels and sounds nothing like Programs B, C, and D, or the organization's sort of umbrella brand, it's just going to be really hard for them to understand that Program A is a part of something bigger. So I'd go with a less is more approach and then build on it from there.
Love it. I think this is a really good question. GuideStar is in the middle of this overhead myth campaign, so I find this fitting for what we're doing right now. Should not-for-profits make a big PR splash about rebranding, or does that turn the public off and it's seen as an unnecessary expense that takes money away from the mission?
Yeah, I generally don't encourage organizations to make a big splash when they do branding, and sometimes it's because of what you said, Lindsay. Sometimes it's because people might perceive it as not about the core work or something like that. But actually, more so, the reason I discourage it is that it's organization-centric. You care a lot about your rebrand. It has significant implications for you, but it really doesn't have significant implications for people on the outside. I have a lot of doctors at a hospital in New York City called Mount Sinai, and I was born at Mount Sinai. I've gone there for years and years. I give them a little bit of money. They just went through a major rebrand, and I noticed over some doctors' appointments and visits that they were changing things over. And this is my business. This is what I look for, what I pay attention to. But do I really care? Not really. As long as they're continuing to provide me with excellent medical care, that's really what I care about. So don't talk about your branding unless there's a real benefit to the people you're trying to reach or to your donors in it for them.
Excellent. Okay, I think one more. So, and this is interesting. It says, how do you know that branding actually relates to increases in supporters and funding?
Yeah, I'm very fixated on that issue too, and I've been tracking for years with our clients what the impact is of the branding. And it's very hard to say that it's only the branding. What I can tell you is that we've seen a lot of organizations that we've worked with and a lot of organizations that we didn't work with have this experience where the process of changing the brand rallies people, the internal culture kind of changes, new leadership is attracted to the organization, new donors are easier to reach and connect with, and it's not just that there's new stuff to work with, it's that people feel excited and rallied around it, and oftentimes that does pretty quickly have an impact on giving. It might, in some cases, we've had organizations who are able to secure larger gifts faster. What I can tell you is that if you do it well, you will almost immediately see a real benefit in the amount of time and money you're spending to create stuff. So your staff is going to spend less time creating stuff. The vendors and freelancers and volunteers who help you with things are going to spend less time creating stuff. And that's immediately going to feel good. It's going to save you some time so that you can focus on other things. And if you have that great transformational experience where everybody's really rallied behind it, you might actually find that there are even some pretty immediate, donor ROIs. But a lot of it is the branding is a long-term strategy, and by using it consistently, by speaking with one organizational voice, you see the benefits the way the Red Cross, by really owning that place of disaster relief in our brains, actually brought in over $100 million in just online, text-to-give donations after Hurricane Sandy. So there are plenty of examples of organizations raising a lot of money because they own a space in our minds, and that's great branding.
Excellent. So I think this will be our last question. We have a lot of people still with us, but you just mentioned consistency, and I think that's really important. Do you have any advice for things people can do to, be more consistent across all of the communications?
Yeah, I mean, I would say whether you're going to change your brand or not, I would really encourage you to put any things that you think should be used consistently, colors, logo, phrases, language you like to use, write it all down, put it in a brand book. It doesn't have to be fancy. It can be a Microsoft Word document, but make sure it's all captured in one place, and then train your staff to do it so that if somebody is making a postcard for their program or a flyer or writing a speech, they know to refer to this document. And again, if you lay out all your stuff on the table and you notice that, 90% of the time you use these colors, or, you've got 3 different logos that are in circulation, but this one is used more than others, make some decisions and commit. And oftentimes it's just about creating some institutional mechanisms like that brand book to move towards a place of consistency. It doesn't cost you a dime.
Excellent. Sarah, thank you so much for being with us today. We have learned so much, and I know we'll get some additional answers from you to some of these questions for your blog and our blog. So, again, thanks for being with us. Everyone on the phone, thank you so much. We will be getting an email with this presentation and the recording soon, and we hope you all have a great day and join us on the next webinar.
Thanks for having me, Lindsay, and thanks everybody at GuideStar for your awesome work.
Our pleasure. Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye.